Well, Professor Lee also mentioned that default of the U.S. dollar would be catastrophic for the world economy. So, in your opinion, what hedging strategies make sense for China going forward?
Well, for China, the most important thing, I believe, is to clearly communicate China's intention, long-term intention to the U.S. counterparts, the U.S. scholars, U.S. policymakers, U.S. politicians, U.S. Financial community, that China seeks to achieve international prosperity rather than China's own prosperity at the expense of other countries' economic prosperity. So the case point is for China to coordinate closely on the issue of the internationalization of the RMB. Okay, so I strongly hold that view, and in China, domestically, I often make that argument. And internationally, I make the same argument. There's no difference between domestically and internationally. And on this regard, I believe Professor Sachs and I hold the same view. And then let me push Professor Jeffrey Sachs one step further. Okay, you argued, which I agree, that U.S. needs a reform of the campaign, a campaign reform, reducing the influence of certain groups of the society in the campaign process. Now, I think, please correct me whether I'm relevant here or not. Okay, seems to me that an alternative, perhaps an easier alternative to a campaign reform, is to have a reform of government agency, specifically to elevate the Congressional Budgetary Office to the level of U.S. Fed, to the level of even the U.S. Supreme Justice, the Supreme Court. Let it become really powerful and independent and professionally managed institution to manage many of the budgetary issues. In other words, to take some of the budgetary issues away from the popularly elected politicians. Many of them, I often joke to my Chinese friends, Jeff, this is a fact, okay? This is not a lack of respect for the U.S. political system. And a small district in China, in terms of population, can elect a U.S. congressman. Now, how can we expect a U.S. congressman being elected from a small community be able to be knowledgeable and to be able very discretionary, very competent in discussing international and domestic issues. Okay, so of course they are wonderful. They are close to their voters. They do community service. Wonderful. But when it comes to international issues and the financial issues and budgetary issues, they may not be on the same page as professional experts and the economists and the financial experts. Okay, so this is so Jeff, I would like to hear your feedback. Whether I'm too far away from U.S. reality.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the political role of the budget process is very deep in the U.S. political and constitutional framework. So it can't really become like an independent central bank to have an independent budget process without really a break of our political system, which I don't believe is going to be conducive to normal outcomes. What happened in the United States, though, is that things got worse in two ways over the last 40 years. On the one hand, the role of campaign financing, which is a kind of corruption, became much more important. And this has really weakened the American political framework. And it's a series of deliberate actions that were taken that corrupted American politics. So this is something that needs to be addressed. The second thing that is absolutely also true is that governance became much more complicated. We have to think longer term. We have to make longer term plans. We don't have an NDRC. We don't have a National Development and Reform Commission like China that is a planning agency. We don't have any long-term plans in the United States by and large, other than perhaps the Pentagon, but even that is not really long-term plan. So governance became more complicated and the political system became more corrupted. This is a big problem. It's mainly a US problem, but US problems can spill over to be whole global problems. So I think we shouldn't expect fundamental dimensions of China's statecraft or US statecraft or any other country's statecraft necessarily to change, because our whole budget process is part of our political history. But we need to understand we're in a new era, that we need to be a lot more serious about how we think ahead and a lot more honest about how we make decisions for the common good. This, I would say, is the major challenge facing the United States right now. Its political system needs upgrading, but it's going to remain somehow in the longer tradition of American political history, which actually dates even from British political history. So we're kind of a child of Britain. And so our budget framework is hundreds of years in the making, but it definitely needs retuning right now.
Yeah, Jeff, I remember you have been arguing this for many years, which I agree. You wrote a book which is called The Price of Civilization. Am I right in citing the book?
Exactly. Thank you very much. That's a decade ago. I said exactly, we need a new budget framework. That was 10 years ago. And by the way, 3 years ago, I wrote a book called A New Foreign Policy, saying we need a new foreign policy framework that would be a lot less expensive and a lot fewer wars as well, based on cooperation of the US and China. So I think we're in the same direction very much.
Very good. Thank you.
Well, I think China and the U.S. certainly have a lot to communicate and learn from each other to make the world economy more stable and more prosperous. So, Professor Sachs, what is your perspective on recent developments related to currency multipolarity? For example, the BRICS are actively promoting local currency settlement, and what would be the impact on the U.S. economy?
I think that the direction of multi-currency makes sense for two major reasons. One is that the United States wasn't responsible in its management of the dollar. And so many other countries are saying we can't rely on the dollar. We can't rely on it politically, and we can't even rely on it technically, because the United States has made some very major technical mistakes, for instance, the one that caused the 2008 financial crisis. So this is one reason. The second is technology. Digital settlements will mean that it's much easier, in my opinion, to go to multi-currency systems, because we don't need the banks the same way to make the settlement. So it was the US dollar banking system, the SWIFT payment system, that kept the dollar so central to an important extent. But digital currencies, I think, will change that. Countries will be able to trade in and settle transactions much more easily than in the past with digital currencies. So for both of these reasons, we're moving to a multi-currency system. What does it mean for the United States? It means a tougher life, because it was a privilege to have the dollar at the center of the system. You could borrow almost for free. You could print money almost without worry in the short run. And the U.S. got used to that privilege. It got lazy, and it's going to pay a price when that privilege diminishes over time. And many of my colleagues say, no, you're completely wrong, Jeff. The dollar is going to remain dominant for decades to come. For example, Paul Krugman a well-known economist, a Nobel laureate, says, no, the dollar is going to remain dominant. I don't believe it. I think in 10 years, the international monetary system, as short as that, in 10 years, is going to look quite different.
Professor Lee, what is your outlook of trade settlement in other currencies, the diversification from the US dollar?
Well, first, I agree with Professor Sachs that there will be multiple currencies emerging faster, perhaps, than Professor Krugman's expected. Okay. Meanwhile, let's face the reality, which I think will be reality. That is, despite the emergence of many currencies, they are eventually might be 2 or 3, I would say no more than 5 currencies, which will be anchors. Let's call them anchor currencies. Because why? Because if you have 20 currencies in international trade, fundamentally people will have to deal with the exchange rate risks, which will become extremely difficult. So in my mind, down the road, in 10 years, maybe 15 or 20 years, there will be 3, no more than 5 anchor currencies emerging, which will have direct and very unpleasant implications for the US. So I do hope for the interest of the US economy, for the interest of the American consumers and the investors and the companies, and also for the interest of the international economy, the world economy. Let's face the reality. Let's wake up. Let's hope the process of the transition from US dollar to multiple anchor, 3 or 4 anchor currency system is not a crisis. It's not a catastrophe. So let's wake up. Jeff, I haven't talked to Paul Krugman for many years. Next time, if I meet him, the first thing I discuss is this issue.
Yes, very good.